the art of like a truly transcendent poem is finding the right balance between control and...
Unfortunately, the moment a lot of poets find spark, they kill it.
Okay, hear me out. You have a blank page staring at you, and if you're like, you have to write the best poem you've ever written in your life, you're gonna write trash.
What were you thinking as you put those poems together for this?
I wanted to read the bangers.
That's a good approach. Some people don't even have bangers to do, so hey.
Yeah. No, I mean, I try to change it up a little with every reading, but since I'm kind of new to the space, I was trying to feel out the vibe kind of on the fly, so I had a lot of poems kind of dog-eared, and then it was just pulling them based on how I feel. I like to self-edit when I do a reading, you know?
What does that mean?
It means I always like over-prepare some poems, and then if I'm just not feeling it, or if the audience is responding to, you know, more narrative or like lighthearted poems, I try to sprinkle in more of those. But if the audience is like craving sorrow, then I'll lean in. I mean, it's poetry. You're gonna get sorrow whether you like it or not. But the question is it going to be sorrow all the way through, or will it be sorrow sprinkled with some levity?
Would you say that happened with us?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that the Oranges poem, based on my dad literally editing Wikipedia, this man, incorrigible. I think that that's funny, even though it ends with, you know, this image of Tripoli burning during the Lebanese Civil War. But one of the interesting things that my dad told me when he was telling me all these stories about growing up in Tripoli during the Lebanese Civil War was that, like, life was still life. It wasn't like it's war, so everyone is sad and suffering all the time, even though, of course, that's it. But also, like, he and his friend were playing like they were pretend shooting at each other while going to collect water miles and miles and miles out of town. Because Israel likes to bomb water tanks, by the way. So that happened during the Lebanese Civil War. But you know, like he has these memories of playing war games with his friend, or like dodging bullets to go get bread, but also just like wanting to be out in the world, and like that not dissuading him from going and exploring, and just wanting to be like a 16-year-old kid. So what point was I making? I kind of got lost in the sauce.
I think that leads into something we were discussing before the show. We were talking about, like, what is something that we can leave people with when we're done here, right? And we got into this discussion talking about emerging writers, what happens to poems. Indirectly, I think this even leads into the topic of like writer's block. One of the things you mentioned was, you didn't directly refer to writer's block, but you mentioned, you know, take the stakes away from the page. And like, that's usually some advice that I think is given to people that are struggling to write. And it kind of, I'm thinking about what you mentioned about your dad in Lebanon, and like, there's all this high stakes stuff happening, and then there's also this low stakes, like you just want to go out and play. And I think when poets are approaching the page, there's a lot of high stakes. We want to write the banger poem that we can get asked to read a lot of time.
I think the key is to not want it. You know what I mean? Okay, hear me out. Like, you have a blank page staring at you, and if you're like, you have to write the best poem you've ever written in your life, you're gonna write trash. You know what I mean? So if you're just like, what is interesting to me right now? Or what am I curious about right now? And if you just take the stakes down a little and focus less on the end result and just focus on where your interest in the writing is, first of all, it's probably going to lead to better writing because you're chasing something that you're curious about, and that's going to end up showing up on the page. But if you're curious about something, there's a good chance that someone else is curious about it too, or that they've been wanting to explore it and they just haven't gone around to Googling it. Who knows? We're all busy. But yeah, I think that you know, focus on the journey when you're writing, and when you're editing, you focus on the end product, like the final outcome.
There's a lot. I think that carries over to so many aspects of life. Like I could speak. It's like I have my own teaching business, and a lot of times on my first call with clients, I'm trying to get them to turn away. Like I'm trying to be like, you know what? Like you don't want to sign up for this. You're gonna have to do this. You're gonna have to do this. Like there's almost this like repulsion.
Yeah.
But the more you repel them, ironically, the more they justify. Because like, no, I need you because you have to do this. Like you're the only one that offers this.
Jeb,
Like,
are you playing psychological mind games with your clients? If you're like, yeah, I'm good at marketing.
but you're doing the same thing with poems.
That's true. I mean, I would argue that it's rhetorical mind games.
I think the reality is that if you come off as too desperate for something, it pulls people away.
I think so too. And like, when you're writing a poem and you're trying too hard, you're gonna see the seams. Whereas if you're kind of like open to being playful or being messy, I think that's a big thing for a lot of folks too. Because I think that a lot of poets tend to be perfectionists. That's me. I'm perfectionist. But if you give yourself license to just like fuck up, like you're gonna make mistakes, that's fine. Be messy, because the mess is more interesting than something really pristine and buttoned up and polished. And I think that the art of like a truly transcendent poem is finding the right balance between control and wildness. You know, like where can you let the fray in, and where can you like keep the structure and keep the things in place that the reader needs in order to experience the wild parts of it.
I think that ties into something that we were talking about is a lot of times when people are writing their first drafts, they think the first draft is taking them on the exact journey that the poem wants, when in reality, the first draft is more searching the dark to find where the spark is. And then, unfortunately, the moment a lot of poets find the spark, they kill it.
Yeah.
Instead of using it to light other candles, you know?
Yeah, I think it's easy to like, once the poem hits its stride, to think like, okay, this is where it should end. And when you're drafting, oftentimes that's like where the poem actually begins. And then if you push past that end point, you can bring in some of the elements that maybe got you to that point and thread them back in if it's important to the emotional logic of the poem or the storytelling that the poem's trying to do. But I find that we are quick to think that momentum equals closing a poem, which I think, you know, you should have or momentum going into a close of a poem. But it's just as important to start a poem with that momentum too. And I think that that kind of gets lost sometimes in early drafts, or it's hard for emerging writers to kind of spot that your wheel's spinning with beautiful imagery, you know?
I would love to know what signs you find, because one of the ways I can tell when a poet is doing that is dramatic shifts that occur, and these shifts can occur in many different forms. It can be that your entire poem is abstract, 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 and then the last stanza, concrete image, concrete image, concrete. It can be maybe your mom is in every single stanza except the close, and it's like, well, where'd your mom go? Or it could be the opposite, right? Your mom's never in the poem, then suddenly this character appears out of nowhere. You know, it can be a shift to suddenly lots of imagery when there was no imagery before. So what are some things that indicate to you that we finally reached the moment that the poem's actually trying to discuss?
Yeah. I think it's funny that all of the things that you mentioned could be argued as different kinds of boltas. And I do think that that's a good instinct for a poet to have, like knowing that something in the poem has to change. I am far more vexed by a poem that's like one note all the way through. Nothing changes ever. This was the idea I came here with. It's the idea I end with. Hope you enjoyed your time. I'm like, no. Do something else. But I think that it's hard. It's hard to figure out like a shift that works. I think that one of the things that helps me with drafting a poem is to read it out loud. And if I start to bore myself, I know I've not hit the mark yet. It's true. Allow yourself to be bored with yourself. It's a good way to gut check your poems.
It takes a lot of honesty, though. I think a lot of poets aren't
No,
taking that.
I don't think it takes honesty, do you? I think it takes a short attention span.
I think people get defensive. I really do. I see people pushing because
Yeah.
I see a lot of justification, like, no, this poem is doing this because there's a lot of pushback.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to get married to early drafts of your work or to like see beyond the thing that brought you to the page. And to me, that's always a sign that like maybe you need a little bit more distance between yourself and the draft. Like if you're not at a place where you can take feedback, you're probably not at a place to re-engage with that poem from a critical, analytical editing lens. So that to me would just be the sign of like, this is my precious. I need to take a break from it. We need to see other poems for a minute.
I took you to, like, you can keep the first draft. First draft will be all yours. You don't have to delete it.
Okay. Yeah, no one can take your Google Drive drafts away from you. Except for Google.
Something I think would be helpful for people to know, from conception to finish, how long does it take you to write your average poem? If there is an average poem.
Honestly, sometimes I've worked on a poem for years, and then sometimes I've written a poem in 10 minutes, which is infuriating. I know people hate to hear that, but it usually means I've percolated on it for a while. Like I've carried the poem in my head or in my heart in some place other than the page for a long time, and then when I finally sit down to write it, it all comes out mostly fully formed. And I am a person of extremes. It's either like all or nothing with me. So yeah, it's either like the average poem is I took years to write it or I took 10 whole minutes to write it. No in between. But I think that's fine. Like, don't box yourself in. Do whatever feels right for you in the poem.
If you had to name another thing that you see emerging writers struggling with, what would you say?
Oh, I don't know. I think assuming that things that are important to you are going to be either immediately important to an audience or intuitive to an audience. So I see a lot of writers who are just starting out in poems, like really lean on their feelings of an experience without really kind of taking us through the experience or describing the experience to us so that way we can feel those feelings about it too. And you know, we do this in conversation with our friends and family all the time. Like, I just expect you to be in my head. Come on. But you can't rightfully expect your audience to be in your head. They're out doing this and that all over the place.
So then the question becomes, how do you get your audience who maybe thousands of miles away from you, never seen you in person, doesn't even know what you look like, the only encounter with you is with your words on a page? How do you make that prediction for what the audience is going to give important?
I mean, you never know. I do think that's helpful to have a specific idea of the audience that you're trying to reach. So, like for me and my first book, my audience was like my family, you know, and writing specifically about like my family, Arabs in diaspora, that weird liminal space of constant betweenness. That's where those poems were coming from, and that's who those poems are for. But also, I tend to write poems I know that my sister's going to like. She's my first reader, and she loves to tell me when I'm full of shit. So sometimes I'll write a line, I'll be like, she's going to tell me to cut that. You know, and it helps. It helps with drafting the poem because I have a firm idea of the audience that I'm writing toward, and it helps my drafts come out cleaner. So while we can't predict what our audience or what audiences in general are going to find compelling or interesting or insightful, we can at least try to write from a place other than ourselves. Like what feels fulfilling to you might not feel fulfilling to other people. And so trying to bridge that with some rhetorical choices can really be helpful, and it can help you bring your audience along for the experience as you felt it. Recreating feelings in poetry is incredibly difficult, but that's why we have all these tools to work with. It's why we use images. It's why we use metaphors. It's why we use sound and repetition, right? We're trying to recreate this very specific feeling that we're trying to name in the world. And those tools can help you shape that feeling and make it real for an audience.
And I think a lot of poets lack that intentionality. So especially starting out, like I do this because I think it's cool. Like I think a lot of times there's almost like we have this like intuition that we're kind of operating by, where we're not fully understanding why, we're not understanding the motivation behind it.
Yeah.
And then the danger of that is like the expression that, like if you only know how to use a hammer and everything starts to look like a nail. So that's why we need to expand our tool set. I want to speak about audience, and I know they're going to be starting off soon, so maybe that's question for now. I agree with you 100% that I think audience is something that we need to be considering to a degree because it shapes everything. There are artists and poets out there that say, my poetry is for everyone. I write for everyone. What do you tell them?
I mean, if they're asking for my opinion on that stance, it's not one that I hold to be true. I don't write for white supremacists, for example. I hope that they're very afraid of my poems. So I think that that's something to think about. Like, it's good to have intention with your poetry because you don't want your poetry to be for everyone. There are some people your poetry should very much keep away and be like, this is not for you. Go read MAGA poetry elsewhere. But also, I understand the impulse behind it. No one wants to say, like, my poetry is only for this specific person or this specific group. And everyone hopes that their poems have reach. But I think that the best way that you can go about that is really finding the people that you are most interested in connecting with. Because if you're connecting with some people, it's going to have ripples and it's going to find other people. But it's going to help you create more intentional, more resonant poems when you have a specific idea of audience in mind. And moreover, if you're writing with audience in mind, you're going to take your poem away from just being a journal entry, for example. Like, it's not something that you wrote just for you, for your own enjoyment and for your own expression. It's something that you wrote to connect with other people, to be in community with other people. And I think that that's the most important thing that we can do with our art. Like, find your people.
Yeah. Like if I'm writing a poem about dads, like teenagers can still connect with that,
I have doubts.
People that were never parents can still connect with that, even though the target people are still they may resonate the most, but that doesn't mean that people outside of that aren't going to connect either.
Yeah. And I think ultimately what we're talking about is self-awareness. Just because you are engaging in an art form that is liberating and that makes you feel free to explore and chase your expression and curiosities, at the end of the day, we want to make those connections. And so that's why it's just important to like have a lens outside of yourself, and to step back, give yourself space between you and your work, come back to it when you feel like you can be objective about it and kind of encounter it as a stranger might. I know that that's hard to cultivate, but it's practice. It's muscle memory. And the more you practice at it, the better it and more easier it will come to you. The easier it will come to you. Sorry, my brain is on its last brain cell.
The very last thing I'll say that I really resonated with too was you mentioned that there are groups of people I want to be very afraid of my work. So I think that when we're thinking about the audience that we create, it's not just about the people that we want to turn to our work, but also thinking about who are we trying to turn away. And almost asking ourselves, what can I do to amplify that even more? Because I think a lot of times we can stick to kind of conservative choices that keep things very open, where it's like, the more I'm able to disconnect some people intentionally, the more I'm able to, the people that, rock with what I'm saying, they're going to resonate with it on a deeper level as well. So I think considering that audience you want, but also almost like that anti-audience can actually be really helpful.
I think so too. I mean, there's a reason why I mention Palestine in every reading that I do, and not just because I feel like we should all be talking about Palestine all the time. It's also a litmus test. Like, are these cool people? Are these people that I want, at my poetry readings, listening and engaging with my poetry? And I've been fortunate in that the people who show up to my readings are people who know what I'm about, and they know how I am politically and how I want to show up in the world. And
the people who know who you are also that don't like it, don't.
Yeah,
Like,
and then they stay away. And it's like, please.
And
Leave
that's
me
what we're
alone.
talking about with the business stuff earlier. So
Listen, I have to be able to rib you, Jeff.
also, if you guys can, give me a round of applause for Ruth.